Coming up on Path to Zero.
People have decided that the way to clean up our carbon dioxide is to electrify everything. And that means that there's going to be more demand on the grid.
Welcome to Path to Zero, the podcast about clean energy and the journey toward a low-carbon future. Your host is Tucker Perkins, engineer, entrepreneur, business leader, speaker, and clean energy industry veteran, who now serves as president and CEO of the Propane Education and Research Council. Now, here's Tucker.
Welcome to Path to Zero. You've tuned in for a special milestone show. In the 4 years since we launched Path to Zero, we've reached our 100th episode. What a fantastic experience it's been to talk to some of the world's foremost experts in climate change and energy. The conversations I've had here with people of different views inspired me to write my first book, also called Path to Zero. In the book, I jumped to the year 2050 and looked back on how we achieved a net zero carbon future with the insight of the 100 guests we've learned from here on the podcast. To celebrate our 100th episode, we've invited back one of our favorite guests who happens to also be featured in the book. Meredith Angwin is a renowned author, an expert on energy and the electric grid. I asked Meredith to write the foreword on the Path to Zero book, and fortunately for us, she accepted. Stick around to the end of the episode. After we talk to Meredith, I'm going to reflect on a few of the most memorable moments from our 100 shows that are featured in the book. You know, a lot's happened with the electric grid and the energy world since we first talked to Meredith in June of 2021. We're excited to get an update from her and talk to her about the groundbreaking book, Shorting the Grid, the Hidden Fragility of Our Electric Grid. Meredith, it's great to have you back on Path to Zero. Thanks for being our 100th guest.
Thank you for inviting me twice. That's lovely.
Well, it's rare air for people that we even think about having twice, and I was excited about having you here. And we're going to talk a lot about a different whole host of different subjects. But let's go straight to you as an author. Your book, Shorting the Grid, now a little bit over 3 years old, I think. Do you have plans for a follow-up book? Do you feel like things are different now than when you wrote the book? Kind of walk us through all that.
Well, I think things are different now. I seem to be kind of stuck a little bit on the follow-up book, but what I'm doing instead is I've started a Substack. And so I have about, I don't know, 20,000 words written for the follow-up book, and I'm writing some Substack, and I feel like eventually it'll come together. But it's not just a drive to write the follow-up book. Now, why that's all very well and good about me and Meredith and what is she doing, but the bigger question is, why are things different? And I think things are different because a couple of years ago, people didn't understand that the grid was fragile. I mean, they really didn't understand it. They say, oh yeah, well, you know, there's a big windstorm. We understand that things don't work so well. But the idea of what happened in Texas, where they were dropping load in the middle of the winter and people were freezing, literally had deaths due to cold, not being able to keep warm because the power was out. And a lot of people in Texas use electric heating, or they have electric controls for their furnaces, or they have heat pumps. And when the power is out, that's a pretty serious business. Anyway, I think Texas was a wake-up call for the whole country. And other things that have happened since then, like, for example, there was a huge power outage, but it was much shorter than Texas in December of 23. But I think people began to say, oh, this is something that can happen and that does happen. We're in 2022 or whenever you interviewed me, people were like, oh, you know, she's a little worried about things, but they're always okay. And they're not, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I mean, I think so much has happened. One, you call attention to Winter Storm Uri, but even if we look to just the last week, Texas has again relatively normal weather and maybe a few degrees hotter than anticipated. But once again, ERCOT goes to their last level of alarm before having uh, some kind of turnoffs. So there's a lot going on in the grid, and to me the one thing that's really going on, and it's everywhere, is the demand is greater than even utilities expected, right?
Yes, yes. I'm going to say two things about that. The first thing is the fact that ERCOT was going to the highest levels of emergency protocols, the highest level before actually shutting people off in May, was a very good example of what I talk about as the grid being fragile. In other words, if it's a day that's 130 in Texas and you have problems on the grid, that isn't necessarily fragility. And that's just like, boy, this has never happened before. But warm weather in May happens fairly regularly. And so when the grid begins to have problems, when that's happening, that is a symptom of the grid being fragile. Then the other thing is about the demand. We have a really weird situation where somehow or other people have decided that the way to clean up our carbon dioxide is to electrify everything. And that means that there's going to be more demand on the grid because, we traditionally use electricity for certain things and not for other things. So, for example, there are only some areas of the world that use electricity for home heating. There are we used to use only gas for transportation, gas and propane and diesel. And all of a sudden people are like, well, we got to switch it to electricity. Well, they're bringing in not just a couple of things, they're bringing in whole units of the economy that used to use other fuels, and they're saying, well, they're going to be electrical. Okay, so where are you building the electrical supply for them? And then people aren't. If anything, they're closing down plants that they feel are not, fitting with uh, their goals for net zero. Well, you have to decide if you're going to electrify everything or you're going to go to net zero, you know?
I think they're mutually exclusive.
I think they are mutually exclusive, at least as a pathway. I mean, if you electrify everything, maybe eventually you can get to net zero, but you're not going to get to it while you're electrifying everything because you gotta keep some plants going to supply that electricity.
And Meredith, we're getting into our conversation much earlier than I expected, but let's get into it. One of the voices that's absent here are the utilities themselves. And I firmly believe the utilities understand they cannot meet the winter peaks or the summer peaks, plus EV demand, plus data center demand. And some utilities kind of call it out. Georgia Power has been one to say, gosh, we grossly underestimated demand. But why do you think the utilities are silent on their inability to meet demand in the next decade? Certainly they see it in their data. Why are they silent?
Well, they're silent because, there's this whole thing that happened well, if they weren't silent, they could get sued. They might get sued anyway. But there's this whole thing about these a bunch of people sued Exxon, right? Exxon knew that there was going to be global warming due to their product, and so Exxon knew they found a internal email that discussed global warming. Well, I mean, as a chemist, I'd like to tell you that Arrhenius, who was in Scandinavia at around the turn of the century, about 1900 or so, he predicted global warming. I mean, this is not something that you can look and say, oh, look at what Exxon found out, and they wouldn't tell anybody. I mean, it was always known that CO2 could lead to global warming. But I think that they're just kind of saying, we won't say it's happening till it happens, and then it'll be a crisis, and then we'll be able to have perhaps more choices in what we do about it. If we begin saying, oh, it's about to happen, then we can be sued for not having done something already.
Yes. Yes, it's really, I mean, as I think about what's different for me, I think the demands on the electric grid continue to surprise. And just because the industrial complex is coming back, uh, the EV charging is certainly there. Data centers are a huge, and electricity is a bigger part of our life. The other issue that I think I've been surprised to see is the price increase. And I feel like years ago, we were talking about a migration to solar and wind. We were thinking, well, I should say, people were thinking that
Yes,
that would generally uh, mean lesser prices. And I still see people talk about it, but now what we see are most every grid is up 30 to 40%. I see now routinely prices in California that are approaching 50 cents a kilowatt hour. I know it's a little different numbers, but last week in Texas, they hit their maximum, I think, of $6,000 a kilowatt hour at the wholesale price level. Are you surprised the conversation has turned now to the pricing of electricity?
No, I thought it eventually would have to, because, to some extent, renewables were sold as, if you pardon the expression, too cheap to meter. They don't take any fuel. I mean, it's just the fuel comes from the sun. This fuel comes from the wind. We don't have to buy the sun. We don't have to buy the wind. It's going to be cheap. Well, meanwhile, if you remember, in my book, I was looking into things, and the percentage of renewables on a grid increased the cost to the grid. There was a important paper, at least I thought it was important, called Cost of Compliance with the Renewable Portfolio Standards. That was delivered at a meeting of a group I was in that was associated with the grid operator ISO New England. There was all sorts of stuff going on that made it clear that it was going to be more expensive to do renewables. And you could just think about something sort of silly if you want. Let's look at paper. So if I go down and I say, I'm going to buy a ream of paper, I'm a writer, and sometimes I print it out and mark it up. Well, you know something, the recycled reams are going to be more expensive. They just are. And similarly, renewables tend to be more expensive than sort of regular. And I that's not a great analogy, but I'm trying to say that people seem, if you look at it a different way, recycled paper, you've already got the paper, so it should be cheaper. But actually it isn't, because it's more complicated to put together a good paper from paper that's already been used and had print on it and so forth.
Yeah, much more complicated. Um, well, yeah, so demand and price. And then let's talk about the last piece that I just think of you, because I know from the first time we met, you're passionate about nuclear energy. It's carbon free, it's energy dense. Um, and really, and now we do have the first new nuclear plant opened in the United States in decades. But I would say nuclear still is something that's being discussed rather than acted on in the US. Do you see it differently?
Yes, I see it the same way. No, I don't see it differently. I see it the same way. It isn't being acted on very much. Now, there are many potential nuclear plants. And so that is good. There's a lot of like data centers that are interested in having a small nuclear plant right there, maybe, because they really they lose a lot of money and they have a lot of problems with interrupted power supplies. But I feel that there's a lot more talk. I was listening to a talk, and I'm sorry I cannot remember who was saying it, but he said, "Do you realize that there are something like 70 nuclear startups in the United States? They're not all going to make it." So there's a lot of ferment and a lot of people trying new things, but looking at cars, for example, for a while there were all kinds of cars from all kinds of companies. But it didn't really settle down to cars for everybody until Ford came up with the Model T. And so I feel we're sort of everybody's trying something, everybody has a little, everybody's doing a startup and so forth. But until we really begin to build some things and have them be relatively inexpensive, then nuclear is not going to get very far. I just want to say another thing about this is, I'm an old lady, and when I was starting out in nuclear, it was pretty clear that nuclear energy was neck and neck financially with coal, and both of them were cheaper than natural gas, and both of them were more expensive than hydro. So that was the way it was then. So the idea that nuclear is there's something about nuclear that makes it insanely expensive or very expensive is not true. And also, if you look at the cost per kilowatt, and I don't have the numbers in front of me, but if you look at the cost per kilowatt for a new plant built by the Koreans, say somewhere in East Asia, it's maybe a tenth, a fifth of the cost in America.
Yeah, I read a scathing report recently on the Nuclear Regulatory Commission that was calling out the obvious, that really there hasn't been a new plant built but one, really, since they came to power. And most of their effort is spent in really blocking nuclear facilities.
Yes.
Meredith, nuclear has so many positives, uh, energy dense, low cost, carbon free, uh, certainly measured in gigawatts and not megawatts. What is the single or two most damaging issues for nuclear power? Why would people oppose it?
People oppose it because of fear of radiation and fear of the fuel and so forth and so on. And there's another issue that people bring up, which is what do we do with the spent fuel? But really, I don't even like to discuss that for a long time, because the spent fuel is compared to most any other industrial process, that there's so little spent fuel that it strikes me as looking for trouble and finally finding some. In other words, let me give you an example about the spent fuel. Our little Vermont Yankee plant here was 620 megawatts, and there is a little coal-fired plant, Merrimack Station, that's 400 and something megawatts. Vermont Yankee refilled with fuel every 18 months, and all the fuel that was delivered to it could be delivered in 2 semis. Okay. Meanwhile, over at the coal plant, 40 coal cars a day, each with 100 tons of coal, were necessary to keep that 400 megawatt coal plant going. So you see, even if the coal only had like 5% ash. That's an immense amount compared to that is 5% of 100 tons times 40. I don't even want to do it. But the thing is, compared to the that's a couple coal car. That's a coal car of ash for sure.
Yeah.
And meanwhile in Vermont Yankee, the 2 semis brought enough fuel for 18 months.
Yeah. And you talk about the nuclear disasters, of which really were 2, right? Can only really speak to 2, Fukushima and Chernobyl, far different designs. And Fukushima, for sure, uh, we don't attribute any deaths to Fukushima, right?
That's right. There was one man who got cancer, and because he worked at the plant and he had there was some kind of insurance. So if people who worked at the plant got cancer, they would be covered by it. So he's considered to have died because of Fukushima caused cancer. But there's no particular reason to believe that he died of something Fukushima caused, because when you get right down to it, people die of cancer all the time. And one person out of I don't know, a couple hundred people who were working there, I mean, a couple thousand. I mean, it isn't reasonable. No, now what happens is that if you're around the anti-nuclear people, if you're around the fiercely negative ones, they love to conflate the deaths from the tsunami, which were about 15,000 deaths, with deaths from radiation. Those people drowned. They were run over they were trapped in buildings that collapsed on them. It was a horrible thing. It had nothing to do with radiation. It had nothing to do with the power plants. As a matter of fact, there was a power plant on the coast, actually closer to the epicenter of the earthquake, Onagawa. And when people lost their homes to the earthquake and tsunami, many of them went to the Onagawa power plant, which was still standing and very safe. And so they went there and stayed there in the turbine hall. It was one of the safest places to be.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody.
Yeah, fascinating. And yet the I mean, really, it prevents having a more meaningful conversation around nuclear. Now, let me ask you 2 more questions. You said earlier you didn't use these words, but you talked a little bit about smaller scale. Let's assume you're talking about small modular reactors.
Yes.
4 years ago, kind of the talk of the town. As we sit here today, really not a lot of action. I think DOE has one test site that's, slowly getting up to running. Do you believe in small modular reactors?
Well, I think they can be very useful. And the question really is the economics. I mean, people began building bigger nuclear facilities because there were economies of scale. I mean, if you look at Vogtle, you'll say, oh no, there's no economies of scale. But if you actually look at the plants that were built in the 70s or stuff, they in the 60s and 70s and the early 80s, they were built for economies of scale, and they're still being built that way by the Koreans. So I guess the thing is that I think that the small modular reactors definitely have a place as they have a place as our grid gets more and more fragile. And some businesses like data centers or aluminum smelters or whatever need nonstop electricity. Then they may decide a small modular reactor is a better deal for them, even if it's expensive, than losing product to power outages.
We're going to take a break, and we'll be right back with Meredith Angwin.
0 is a big number.
Getting close to a zero-emissions future starts with using the broadest mix of clean, low-carbon energy sources. You might be surprised to know that propane produces a lot of energy for thousands of purposes and millions of people with virtually zero particulate matter, zero impact to the ozone, zero toxicity, and zero potential for storage-related contamination. It's low NOx and low CO2 to boot. Path to Zero is sponsored by Propane. Energy for everyone. Learn more at propane.com.
Maybe I'll win if I zero.
Welcome back. We're talking to our 100th guest, a very special person, Meredith Angwin, and you can find her on Substack as the Electric Grandma. Let me ask you about one other piece of nuclear. Last 3 years, the conversation has turned a bit to fusion. In fact, there are at least 2 commercial contracts out there now to supply fusion power in the future, which I'm not still quite sure how that works commercially. When do you tend to think that fusion power may be a commercial reality?
I hate to be so negative, but I'm just going to say never. End of story, never. And the reason for it is that it has problems that they're always saying, "Oh, we broke even," but you see, broke even is in energy is a real tricky thing, because when they say they broke even in energy, they were like, "Oh, the lasers or whatever that we put in to make the plasma, we got as much thermal energy out as we put in with the." Well, yeah, but what about all the electromagnets that you're using? Huge electromagnets to keep the fusion material in a confined space. You see, in a star, gravity keeps it in a confined space. It's a big star and it's got a lot of gravity. And as a matter of fact, stars in the sequence of stars, they tend to get smaller and smaller and then they eventually, they often blow up as a nova. But what I'm trying to say is gravity is doing all this stuff. Okay, gravity is overcoming the forces that keep atoms apart. And we're going to instead do that with electromagnetic force made by a power plant somewhere. I mean, I don't think so. And there's another thing which nobody ever talks about, and maybe they shouldn't, but the first time I heard a talk about fusion, or not the first time, but one of the times I heard talk about fusion, we were talking about what we call the first wall problem. And what it means is when you have fusion, you have a lot of neutrons running around, and when those neutrons hit the wall that's holding the plasma in, they cause changes to the crystal structure. And so you may have designed something absolutely wonderful to hold them in, and by the time it's been running for maybe, I don't know, 6 months, it's got a whole different crystal structure. It could be cracking like crazy. Now, you see, the thing is that there's a slightly equivalent problem because there are neutrons running around in fission, but there's so many different things that are controlling the neutrons in the fission. There's control rods, there's water, you don't have that same. Here you have a plasma with plus neutrons, and you're hoping the first wall will hold up against it.
That's I mean, of course, everyone has to respect your credentials on nuclear power. I don't have to remind many people you were one of the first, if not the first, woman to be a project manager at the Electric Power Research Institute.
I was one of the
I would
first.
say you have certainly spent your life dealing with nuclear power, so I appreciate that. Meredith, let's go back to the fragility of the grid. You talk so nicely and informatively on on all aspects of it. If we're going to live in a world that's less nuclear than I think we all know the numbers would suggest we need, and we're going to take away coal, we're going to take away oil. We're fighting to keep natural gas because I think that's much cleaner than those choices. But we're living in a world where we continue to see more and more solar and wind. That would mean it's going to necessitate storage, right? So solar or wind without storage are not that useful as we see weekly now in some of the hotter places or colder places. What do you believe that renewable advocates solve the storage dilemma?
No, I mean, unlike my views toward fusion, I think the storage dilemma could be solvable. I mean, I think that the nature of materials in this world means that you're not going to come up with something that can take a plasma that can hold in a plasma with tons of neutrons running around, because whatever you come up with will change so quickly. But I think storage could conceivably be solved. I mean, it's a hard problem, but it is not an unsolvable problem. But I feel that people are acting as if it's already solved, and it isn't. So people are like, oh, we'll put in a lot of solar and, then we'll store it. Well, you're going to end up basically putting in a lot of solar and curtailing it. Because the idea that you're going to store immense amounts of solar, it's not a reasonable idea. Or let's say someone says, no, but you can. Look, you can store it and you can do this and that. And I said, okay, fine. You're telling me how we can store it from noon to 8 p.m. That's great. What are you going to do about winter? We still have it, What are you going to store solar power that comes during July, and you're going to have it available to run your grid in January? I don't think so. And so I just don't feel that people are being reasonable about what they say about solar.
So Meredith, I have to ask the question. You live in a place where the conversation is very much pro some of these new forms of energy, solar, wind, and very anti fossil fuels, even though you live in a place that probably relies more on heating oil and diesel fuel than almost anywhere I can think of in the country. When do you think the average consumer will begin to connect fragility, expense, lack of reliability, even a complete shift from the power grid that you and I have known for our lives? And that when do you think they will realize that we are heading down a path that is far different from the path they are being told?
I think it's beginning a little bit. So, for example, like you, I don't try to just sing to the choir. I try to be at places which are not totally sold on nuclear or fossil or whatever. So I was on a panel which was run by the Sierra Club and, believe it or not, 350org, or it's not 350org, it's something for seniors, for older people, that's part of McKibben stuff. So here's the Sierra Club and McKibben's group of sponsoring this panel, and I'm on it, and there's Sierra Club people on it. And they weren't anti-nuclear. They were like, well, we need it at least for a while. We need it at least for a while. Man, you could have knocked me over with a feather, because I remember when I just got people so angry when I would say, that I was pro-nuclear. I remember going into a bathroom, and a woman in the bathroom said to me, "You have disappointed me so much. I can't believe it." And I thought, I don't even know you. But the thing is that she didn't think women would be pro-nuclear, and I had just made a very strong pro-nuclear statement. So I think it's changing. I think people are aware that we need to have sort of an all hands on deck attitude compared to where they felt a few years ago.
Let me ask you one last question. I tend to study a lot of the other economies and societies to see just what's worked. I mean, what's not working. As I think about nuclear power, France tends to be very much pro nuclear power. They've been absent this conversation around spikes in price or supply vulnerability. It's working in France. Why do you think other countries, other economies, uh, are reluctant to use the models that I think that's worked successfully for France and frankly has not been successful for places like Germany? Why do you think we think that everything is different and we need not learn from what France has done right and perhaps what Germany has done wrong?
Well, the Greeks had a word for it, hubris. I mean,
Mhm.
really,
I wish
unwilling.
that wasn't your answer, but I fear that it's a truthful answer.
Well, I try to be truthful. I mean, I don't like the idea that I'm changing what I think is scientifically true for some political reason. I was a scientist for my life, not a I never ran for office. So I never had to see, I wonder what they'll vote for. I was like, I wonder what the truth is. And but why do they do this? I mean, I have I have no idea beside hubris. People don't want to learn from their enemies. And I'm going to say that, for example, France and Germany have been going at it since at least the 1870s with the Franco-Prussian War. Maybe it was the 1880s. And they don't want to learn from each other. We don't want to follow them. They're the bad guys.
Very interesting. There is, I think there is a lot to learn, pro and con. Um, and by the way, I think even for us as consumers and taxpayers, there's a lot to learn, pro and con as well. So thanks for that. You talked earlier about your migration to Substack. I was really excited to see that you were a little bit kind, but you didn't tell our listeners that your site on Substack has one of the best names in the history of Substack. Meredith is the Electric Grandma. Love that.
Thank
But
you. I
um,
love the
I
name
follow
too.
you on Substack, and I follow you. I would follow you wherever you are. But you recently wrote a great piece about the could grid. The could grid. What did you mean? What's the could
Well,
grid?
the could grid is the grid that's everybody knows about. What I mean is, it's what could happen. I mean, all we need is the batteries. All we need is the transmission lines across the Rockies. All we need is this. All we need is that. And there's a breakthrough here. There's a breakthrough there, and everybody knows about the could grid. So I will spend a whole lecture, I mean, a talk, trying to explain to people about dispatch rules and how they affect larger power plants on certain kinds of grids, and I make it as clear as I can do. And then in the question period, somebody's going to raise their hand and say, "But do you know about the new battery that was just announced in a public in a and there's an article about it in the Washington Post today?" Or I no, that's the could grid. I have enough trouble following the real grid. What's going on the real grid. I feel
I
that
agree.
everybody knows the could grid, and so they because that's what's in the papers. That's what's in the papers. Unless there's a big power outage, everything's about the could grid.
Yes, well said. I cannot recommend that article enough. Follow the Electric Grandma on Substack and find the could grid. Meredith, one last question for you in this whole vein. As I travel and speak and also travel and listen, a lot of people will talk about the need to get away from the different balancing authorities and move to a national grid, one that's controlled by a single entity. And that would solve so many of the interconnect problems. Speaking of a could grid, I tend to agree, but I'm quick to say I think that there is zero likelihood that we would have a federal grid. Do you tend to agree to that?
Oh, I totally agree with that. I mean, one of the things is we are from sea to shining sea here. We're in different time zones. We are in different weather patterns. And I wish people could go into a balancing authority like ISO New England has got a beautiful balancing authority dispatch room, and there are multitude of workstations in that. It's not just one guy. Oh yeah, it looks like it's going to be great. There's multiple workstations. There are people who are watching whether lines are getting overloaded. There are people who are watching whether power plants that said they could come on and they bid into the day ahead market, are they actually able to come on? There are other people in my area that are actually watching the how the gas lines are going, because we get 40% of our 50% of our electricity from natural gas. So how the gas lines are going, and in the winter, how the LNG ships are coming in to Boston Harbor. I mean, they're tracking LNG ships. And so what I'm trying to say is, I can't imagine somebody sitting in, Kansas City, Missouri, who is busily tracking LNG ships into Boston Harbor, watching there's big news programs and weather programs up on the walls in the balancing authority room, because they got to know if there's a police action, or there's a big fire, there's and so forth. You can't balance everything through this whole country. And as a matter of fact, if let's say you want to import some power from, I don't know, your next door grid and so forth, a lot of time you import it as DC, so that the people don't have to balance the phases of the two big grids. And people are like, oh no, this person in Omaha, no, they'll take care of it. And I'm like, yeah, they're going to watch everybody's local news station to see what's going on. I don't think so.
And you certainly know. But it's a great answer. All right, we're going to have some fun. I love to ask my magic wand question, but I have to first preface it. You're the first time we've had a two-time guest. You'll be
Yes.
the first person that gets a second magic wand. Now, you still get to only use that wand one time for one thing to make the most difference in climate change and energy over the next year. So lots of ones in there. Now, I'm going to remind you, and I can still remember it as though you said it to me just a few moments ago. When I asked you how to use your wand, you said that all nuclear power plants that are operating safely can continue to operate for the next year and then extend for the next 20. You wanted to see that nuclear power plants, because at the time, if you remember, there were two or three that were very much in vogue. And I think of those, two were shut down and one, California, was kept open.
Yes.
But Meredith, how would you use this fortunate and magical second wand?
Well, I'm not going to use it twice, but I am going to say that what I said before still holds. I don't know if that's using it twice, but I would say that I would like people to understand that the whole thing is a process, and this a process with plans and trade-offs and so forth. the idea is that at this point, people are going around saying, well, we just can't use that fuel now because after all, global warming. And I'm like, well, what are you replacing it with? Well, that isn't important. We just can't use it. What I'm trying to say is it's a process, and treating it as if they had a magic wand and some kind of amazing fuel could suddenly spring up and take the place of all the fossil fuels and the nuclear fuels and so forth. A lot of them are as against nuclear as they are against fossil. Uh, I just feel like look at it as a process. Look at it. What can we do? What can we move? How do we move the needle? How do we change things in the right directions? You know, like the Japanese, they're like continuous improvement. If we could think continuous improvement instead of miraculous changes, I think that would be what I would like with the magic wand.
I love it. Thank you so very much. Well, and if also, we like to plant a tree in your name and in your honor, just for the time you share with us, the expertise you just are so open with so many people about. And here I hope that you recall last time you picked the Green Mountain National Forest, and I'm going to give you a chance to change, or I'm going to also give you a chance to start your own forest inside that forest, because I hope you're back on many more times. But where would you like a tree planted in your
I
honor?
just I just like it in Green Mountain National Forest. It doesn't have to be a little grove of my own. That's
Well,
fine.
we will
You
be excited, and I cannot imagine a more appropriate place than the grove of your own. So we'll look forward to that. All right, as we wrap up, let me just ask. I know we can follow you on Substack. Anything else you're working on? Anywhere you're speaking? Anything you'd love our listeners to know about what you're doing and working on?
well, right now I'm working on reality about wind and not wind bashing, but for example, trying to figure out, I mean, people are like, well, the wind's always blowing somewhere. What does that mean? Have been able to find two excellent articles about this, one for the Northeast and one for Texas. And I'm kind of working with those to try and understand things. What I was on the Sierra Club program, and one of the things they said was, in 15 years, we'll have offshore wind around here. So nuclear won't be as important. And I'm like, I'm not sure that's actually true. So I'm working on that, and I'm on uh, a lot of universities. I don't know, for some reason, maybe it's because I'm getting old, but I really I really treasure being able to speak to university students. And I've spoken to people at Oregon State, and there's another one also. I just really appreciate that. And that's one of the things I'm doing.
That's so great. I don't know how to thank you. I'll never be able to thank you enough for writing the foreword to my own book. Cannot thank you enough for just being a steadfast partner since we first met, in helping share ideas and just talk through concepts. And it's just been wonderful to not only learn more about what you have done, but to get a chance to call you a friend. And I'm so appreciative of it. Thank you
Thank
so much for being
you.
our 100th guest. That's a special act. That's a special acknowledgement, I think, of what you've done to us, but also thanks for being here on Path to Zero.
Thank you very much.
As I mentioned at the start, I'd like to highlight a couple of notable exchanges over these 100 episodes that I selected to feature in the book. I've hosted a wide range of industry thought leaders and experts on the topic of clean energy and the journey towards a low carbon future. The first is with Dr. Scott Tinker. He's one of the most influential geologists in the world and host of the PBS show Energy Switch. In our Path to Zero conversations in 2021, he made the point on how there's actually no such thing as renewable energy.
Building the solar panels and the wind turbines and moving it on wires and And then backing those up when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing takes a lot of energy. It takes a lot of either backup plants or batteries. And those all come from mining and burning. And then we make these things, these turbines and panels, and mostly not in the US. It's made overseas. And in big manufacturing plants, especially the batteries, chemical manufacturing plants. So you make these things, you have to make a lot of it to capture that energy. And then you have to, it wears out. So batteries wear out. We all understand that. Well, so do solar panels and wind turbines. We don't do a very good job of recycling those. It's hard, and there's so many of them now, and they're growing. So we dump them in landfills. So whenever I ask students if they think mining and manufacturing and landfill disposal is green, they shake their head and say, of course not. I say, well, why is solar and wind and batteries green then? And so we connect the three dots. And it's a moment. It's always a moment where they think, wow. But climate change, they go right back to climate change. We got to do it for climate. And I say, I'm important topic for sure. And climate is a big piece of the environment, but so is the land and the air and the water. Those are the pillars of the environment. And you can't disadvantage the land, the air, and the water in order to address one. Anytime you go too far in the direction of something, you hurt the others. So this is the challenge. It's thinking a little bit more critically than just black and white, good and bad, clean and dirty, believer, denier. It is not binary, Tucker, and that is so important for young people to understand. It is not binary. It's more complex than that.
Another of our 100 interviews that's featured in the Path to Zero book is with Richard Palmer, the founder and recently retired CEO of Global Clean Energy, a company that provides some of the lowest carbon intensity renewable fuels in the marketplace. Global Clean Energy is a leader developing the game-changing crop camelina, which is quickly becoming a popular feedstock for renewable fuels production, including renewable propane. Richard makes a strong case on the need for liquid fuels in the fight against climate change and the importance of carbon intensity in the measure of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases.
I think the world is moving towards more sustainable electricity generation sources, but it's going to take quite a bit of time to get to that. Liquid fuels is here now. You can grow it sustainably. You can grow it with a huge environmental benefit. And they are drop-in replacements that for change that can be made now and have a huge impact on the environment. So we could sit around and wait until everything else is in order and then try to go electric and see how that works. Or we can do electric as a portion of it, liquid fuels as a portion of it, and then back to the other things. It's not just one solution. You know, we have the ability through controlling the entire vertically integrated market to be below zero, not just at zero.
Just a few of the conversations featured in the Path to Zero book, which will launch during Climate Week in New York City in September. You can pre-order the book right now wherever you buy your books. We're really looking forward to our next 100 episodes. Thanks for listening, and see you next time on Path to Zero.
Thank you for listening to Path to Zero with Tucker Perkins. If you like what you've heard, subscribe and rate us on your favorite podcast app. You can email us with questions or comments to pathtozero@propane.com.